Kumi. So this is the forward-looking session where we're going to delve a bit deeper into some of the themes that have come out from the presentations. But to kick this off, we have three speakers. We have Professor Francesco Vona, who's a professor of economics at the University of Milan. He is not with us at the conference, he's joining remotely. Then we have Dr. Anne Wolverton, who is a senior research economist at the National Center for Environmental Economics at US EPA. And then we have Steve White, who's the chair of our working party on integrating environment and economic policies, which has done the work in environmental justice, and obviously at the European Commission. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to invite each of the speakers to share their thoughts in about 10 to 12 minutes, so that we have hopefully half an hour to hear from the room. I think I'm sure a lot of people around the room have a lot of reflections and ideas in terms of where to go next, both on this broader theme of environmental justice, but more specifically also what might be areas which could be pursued through policy relevant research, and specifically if you have additional thoughts on what OECD could do. Some of the speakers in the previous session already gave us some ideas. So let me first invite Francesco to make his presentation, if he is online already.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Thanks
a lot for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I cannot share my screen, so can you give me please the rights to share the screen, because
yeah, I think they're trying to do that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. So actually, I'm gonna say something about the very much connected with the previous session about especially the just transition. So focusing a bit on the dynamic aspect of the now I can. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So let me minimize this and okay. So again, thanks a lot for inviting me here. I'm working at the University of Milan, but I also coordinating a team on exactly these topics at the FEM, Fondazione Enrico Mattei. And so actually we are this talk is based also on a couple of surveys that I wrote, one for the OECD and the other one that is in preparation for RIP with the other co-authors from especially from the CMCC, the Euro-Mediterranean Center for Climate Change. So actually, as you know, there has been a growing concern on the acceptability of green policies, and actually this is a bit paradoxically because the real idea of the Green Deal plan is to overcome the resistance of people, especially of people, of low-skilled people, or let's say low-income people, to green policies. Okay, but now you can see that there has been a revival of also in Europe, in the US we know that it's like this, but also in Europe of the anti-green, a kind of anti-green populistic backlash. Here there is this Fiocchi advertisement for the European election is just all over the place in Milan where I live, and there is this Miss Thunberg goes back to school, and it's really clearly again against the green policies. And you know that there is also the same problem. More at the high level. There is also the Financial Times in several articles point out this problem that populism could derail the green transition. So actually, I think this connection is extremely important. I mean, the political economy connection is extremely important. It will be key part of my talk. And actually, these compound two kind of ideas. One idea is that are distributional effect of the green transition regressive, and so they generate opposition, especially from people that were already hit by other transformations, and this is really evident in the Yellow Vest case. I mean, the Yellow Vest case, there is all this. I mean, for instance, Piketty point out that the Yellow Vest was not because of the increase of the carbon tax, but because people were already at the limit of their acceptance of the policy of Macron in that case, and they were not, they were not perceiving this policy as fair because it was just, the idea was to recycle these revenues to cut the tax for the ultra rich. Okay, so this intensified debate is, I mean, what's behind? I mean, of course, there is always behind the regressivity of the transition. I mean, this is highly debated in the environmental economic literature, whether carbon taxes are regressive or not. I mean, we know energy is a necessity good, so actually it's obvious that if you tax a necessity good, it tends to be regressive. But I mean, here is regressivity is even more worrisome from, again, a political acceptability perspective because the transition is policy driven. Okay. Then we have another issue that emerged also in the previous discussion a lot. And I mean, for instance, was mentioned in the previous session, the idea that we don't have just to look at the coal miners of carbon intensive occupation and lose their jobs, but we have also to look at the unfairness generated by climate impacts on the people that are more exposed. So actually, the problem is that here we have multiple dimensions. So each individual aggregate in a way, economic impact, environmental impact, the risk of exposure to climatic conditions in a different way, depending on the perception of these impacts, but also depending on their preferences. So, for instance, we know that people with lower income have, I mean, they care less about the environment. I mean, because they perceive the environment as a kind of luxury good. So then we have the issue of failures of previous transition. So we cannot deny that the China shock was, for instance, mismanaged in both Europe and in the US. We know this. There is a huge literature on this. So, for instance, my colleague Italo Colantone wrote a nice paper where he shows that import competition from China reduced the voting from green parties. Okay, and then of course we know that there is, I mean, the political identity also drives this increasing polarization on green issue. I always show to my student this picture for the United States, where the PW Research Center asked to people which is the most important issue in politics, and you can see that the most polarized issue are environment and climate change, where there is the biggest difference between Republicans and Democrats. And I think this is well known, but we have to understand how to contrast polarization that is rising, increasing also in Europe on this issue, because we want, that this issue can be bipartisan. I think that's the goal, no? Ultimately. Okay, so what the economic literature does, I'm an economist, so I will just give you a quick perspective on this. I mean, the economic literature, still struggle to keep pace with the issue of the just transition that, was emerging in other literature. I mean, most of the focus is on spending theory, using, this theory of tax incidence that is the basic of environmental economics. So then mostly the focus on source income is on the functional distributional effect. So not on the heterogeneous effect across worker that we know is the most important for other transitions, but mostly on capital versus labor. There is, the environmental justice literature, as we know, emphasize a lot and correctly the potential progressivity of environmental policy in terms of non-monetary benefits, so health benefits because of lower pollution. But this is just, there is not the attempt really to look at both this benefit and the cost. The political acceptability remain a bit in the background in the literature. Now it's becoming more important, but it's something that is not at the root of environmental eco. The just transition instead is quite different, as you know, is more about large and persistent distributional effect as opposed to effect on spending that are normally not very large. The origin is on labor, so all the focus is on labor, and I will discuss a lot labor market impact in my talk. And the idea, of the ILO is that you have to combine green jobs and decent jobs, and so actually a green job is not a green job if it's not also decent. And a lot of emphasis has been also on the spatial dimension, of concentrated impact on distressed community and potential negative multiplier effect. And there is in the just transition literature an explicit concern, because this literature is emerging in political science on, of course, political processes. So actually, in this literature, which are the 4 dimensions that emerge to evaluate the effect of the transition, there are basically One is really much the economic one, the distributive justice, I mean, distribution of cost, of benefits across different groups and individual. Then there is the dimension of restorative justice, I mean, how to repair the injustice created by the transition through compensation. Also, on these economists have something to say, as I will show you. And then there are two aspects that are, less analyzed. One is about the participatory justice, which, I mean, as economists, we just look at, in a way, the political economy, political acceptability, but there is the entire issue of participation of community and which is much broader, and recognition justice. So how the effect compound with past inequality that are not only related to income, but are also related to cultural differences, gender inequality, etc., etc. So what we know about the energy transition for each dimension, and how, especially because this is a current theme, I think, of the entire conference, how to operationalize these criteria with good data. And I will show you some example on, especially on the labor literature. So first of all, I mean, let me just focus 1 second on the distributional justice, where economists have more to say. And here I'm following the OECD working paper I wrote a couple of years ago. So actually, we know, I mean, 5 facts that are important to retain. First, effect are regressive on spending, because, I mean, as I told you, energy is a necessity good, but they are unclear on income sources. So it's unclear whether the effect is stronger, negative effects are stronger on skilled workers rather than skilled workers, because, for instance, you have a lot of job creation in construction sector that is employing a green subsidy create jobs in construction that is a low skill intensive sector. So then we have particular severe distributional effect on carbon intensive regions, well known. The benefits are progressive, well known, I mean, just transition literature, and the two most important issues are the point 4 and 5. So dynamically, low skilled worker, even if the effect on, I mean, statically they're not regressive, find it more difficult to adapt, because simply adapting is costly. So we are financially constrained to adapt. And the classical example is the one of green subsidies. I mean, you can just take a green subsidies if you have, I mean, a subsidy to retrofit your house, if you have a house, or if you have liquidity to start to pay upfront the company retrofit your house, even if after the benefits will materialize later in terms of lower energy cost in the house. And then the last point that is also very important is that poorer household perceive non-monetary benefit that, as I told you, are progressive, as less important than monetary cost. So actually there is a kind of problem of internal aggregation of each person of the benefits and costs that make the policy that is perhaps progressive, because, I mean, non-monetary benefit can be very large in terms of health, for instance, that make the policy kind of regressive, okay? And for instance, there is this example of this nice paper on network climate change of Hoffman et al. That shows that the impact of heat waves in Europe is only changing the voting pattern of people in rich regions. So in poor region, there is no sensitivity to, I mean, the exposure of to climate impacts is not changing the political preferences. Okay. So in terms of other dimension, what we can say in the economic literature here, as I told you, there is less literature. I mean, the research is more emerging now. I mean, we know that there is a new research on the acceptability of different green packages, and there is this very nice research of the Chalapret et al. At the OECD that trying to understand which is the best policy package in terms of acceptability. And we know that green earmarking and infrastructural program are always preferred to carbon taxing, recycling carbon tax with, for instance, cutting taxes on labor or on capital. And this is a well-known fact. There is some missing aspect, again, on the dynamic adjustment. And I mean, which package also is able to create new opportunity? I think on this really is a missing step on the research, because we have always to think about the transition as something dynamic. So we have always to think about, which policy also and which restorative policy is able to create opportunities to the kind of losers. Okay. So there is procedural justice, as I told you, there is increasing attention on acceptability, but still there are lots of issues that are not covered. I mean, the big issue, for instance, is how much people trust government, the general fairness of the initial condition in a way, and I mean, all the issue more related to the micro level of, for instance, participatory democracy. And I mean, on recognition justice, we know that there are inequality both in impact and in effect on the, on source income. And I mean, we have always to consider how this effect compound with existing inequality, and we did some research on this. And there is also this nice comparison done by Anson on the comparison between the China shock and the coal miner decline in the US. And I mean, is a reflection on how to compare, I mean, manage transition that perhaps compound and make everything worse for certain communities. I mean, let me zoom briefly on the last few minutes I have on the labor market impact. Here we developed quite a few indicators that allow to identify better winners and losers. I mean, we have, I mean, now kind of well-known approach to measure green jobs that is based on tasks, so allow to overcome the problem of lack of data on green jobs, and allow also to define in a smoother way green jobs based on the task content of occupation. We replicate this approach using online job vacancy data, using machine learning techniques, semantic similarity technique, and we are doing this also for Europe now. And then we have a new research on the carbon content of jobs. Here, I mean, is quite important to identify the losers beyond coal miners. And the interesting point that we found, I show you some fact on this, that that high carbon content jobs are often hard to decarbonize. Here you can see that the distribution of the initial carbon content in 2003 compared to the growth rate of the carbon content like almost 20 years after in France, where we have very, very good microdata to compute in a extremely precise way the carbon content of jobs. And you can see that the jobs that are more carbon intensive at the beginning, they did not decarbonize faster than other jobs. So we have really hard to decarbonize jobs that are, I mean, here we focus on manufacturing, so for instance, in manufacturing. Carbon-intensive jobs are also not only hard to decarbonize, are highly spatially concentrated, well known in the US, less obvious in France, where we don't have, there is not an extraction sector that is strong. They are much more exposed to trade and automation. Here in this figure, you see that the correlation between the carbon content of an occupation and the import from China at the beginning of our period, 2003, 2005, and at the end of our period, you can see that the correlation is extremely high. They are declining in terms of employment. This is not surprisingly, I mean, everywhere they are declining, but they pay higher wages than green jobs, okay? And this is exactly what we found also in the US, where there are more, the explanation is more kind of oil rents, but here also we observe rents for high carbon jobs. Here, another example of how to use our indicators. Here we develop an indicator of which skills are important in green jobs, using a kind of reveal preference method, a kind of a method where we let the data reveal the comparative advantage of certain skills to perform green tasks. And you can see here we compare the region where that are in red in the US, where there is a high intensity of carbon of high carbon jobs, or in this case really fossil fuel jobs. And in green, the regions where there is the higher endowment of green skills, which is our idea. The idea is that the important point to transit from brown to green is the opportunity to have a green job, but is also to have the skills to create incentive for the people to invest in that particular region. And you can see that there is a very highly heterogeneous path, where there are some regions where they have green skills and fossil fuel jobs, other regions where there are fossil fuel jobs but not green skills. And so these again on the dynamic. On the wage puzzle, I told you, I mean, French data shows that there is a wage premium for carbon intensive occupation. Exactly the same we found in online job vacancy data for the US, and we found also the green wage premium conditional on a lot of factors is eroding, and is eroding. Here we have the 6 key green occupations, that 6 key occupations that contain a lot of job vacancy that are green, a lot, I mean, kind of 10% each. maximum 10%. And you can see that especially for engineers and physical scientists, there is a decline of the green wage premium over time. I mean, yeah, we divided in two periods the sample, conditional on a lot of other factors. And again, you can see the same pattern of decline of the brown wage premium, but the brown wage premium is much, much higher than the green wage premium. And so again, we have a problem of a wage gap between green and brown jobs. How these, I mean, I told you, the just transition is about political economy, okay? So how all of these translate into voting, okay? So here, what we did for Europe with Italo Colantoni, Piero Stanning, and Enrico Cavallotti, we try to measure, we have a database where we have the information very detailed on the occupation of the worker, and we have, we know who they vote, okay? So if they vote the Green Party or this environmental broad are the scores of the greenness of the party. I mean, they are doing with the manifesto project that is able to rank parties in terms of how green is the platform. You can see that, as expected, brown worker, here we use predicted brownness. I mean, we try to reduce endogeneity in the occupation using the predicted brownness from the structural characteristics of the regions. I mean, brown workers are less likely to vote green. Green workers are more likely to vote green. I mean, here the numbers doesn't mean they're not elasticity, but more or less a standard deviation in green and brown change the voting behavior between 5 and 10%. So it's quite a reasonable effect. They're not big. Yeah, they look bigger, but they're not big. So actually, the interesting point, and this is our second key fact, is that if we differentiate the effect of being, we differentiate brown voters that are in a region where there is also quite a lot of the green economy is going well. I mean, there are investments in a green economy, and a brown worker in a region where there are not investments in a green economy, we find completely different pattern. I mean, the brown workers have a low predicted greenness, so is in a region with low kind of opportunity in a green economy, and is high brown, is going to vote is less likely to vote for green. I mean, these two indicators, green and brown, are continuous index of greenness and brownness of the occupation. Okay. However, if the brown workers is high predicted brownness, high predicted greenness in a region where there are opportunity in the green economy, is likely to vote for green. I mean, the message is here to create opportunity for the regions that are, distressed and brown in the green economy, and this is to focus very much the Green Deal plan for this region. I think beyond the idea of the Just Transition Fund that is very much related to just, offsetting the people, but really creating new opportunity is extremely important. Okay. So what we know about the labor market policy for to help displaced worker, I mean, obviously there is all the debate between reskilling program and enhanced severance payment. I mean, obviously for what I said, the reskilling programs are much better than the other option because they allow to create dynamically new opportunity, but they are less acceptable. Okay. So actually, the problem is you see that always the tension between, there's always a trade-off between acceptability and efficiency of a policy that restore kind of a justice, tackle in a way inequality. Okay. The good news is also that in the transition from green to carbon intensive job, the skill requirement is similar. So the reskilling, I mean, the training costs will be not so high. The bad news is that, I mean, we found this engineering and technical skill bias, but we don't find the returns to such skill. And we also find a strong gender bias that should be tackled with very specific policy to, I mean, expand, I mean, STEM education for women. The other key, tension is between helping distressed regions or helping workers from, all the literature on place-based policies. I mean, here, I mean, what we found, I mean, in this evidence is that helping region is better than helping worker. Again, this is well known, but it should be clarified again in this context. The third issue is that Green Deal plan are designed to tackle political equity issues. I mean, to create green jobs that, overcome possible resistance from workers, low-skilled workers especially. But I mean, as we show, the acceptability of this plan is eroding, and there are reasons. For instance, the reason of the map that I show you for the US, that the high carbon regions not always can benefit from the green transition. We have our ongoing research for Europe. We found exactly the same, that regions that benefit more from green industrialization are basically regions in Germany and in Denmark that are already rich. And so we can have problem again on the progressivity here at the regional level of the policy. And then, I mean, we have the wage issue. I mean, the wage issue is, I think, the key issue to create, I mean, to incentivize people to go to work in green jobs, and especially incentivize people to leave brown jobs, because brown jobs are well paid. I mean, and this is something that perhaps requires specific wage policies. I mean, for instance, requires conditionality on the wage you pay if you receive a green subsidies. I mean, this was introduced, I think, in the US in the American Recovery and Investment Act, but I think this policy should be more aggressive also for incentivizing brown workers to leave these jobs and not to express their political resistance toward the green transition. I think I finish, and so I'm happy then to take questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Francesco. Fascinating review of literature. I'm sure there are lots of questions. If there's a burning question, I have a few, but I just want to check if somebody else would like to step in. Just one quick question, because we're running a bit behind time also, so I'd like to move to the other speakers. This whole issue of wage premiums and the brown jobs, you know, offer higher monetary rewards than green jobs. I mean, there's also the issue that, you know, the wage is just one of the factors. I mean, there's also the job security, there's quality of jobs. Are there any benefits to green jobs on these other metrics, and do they matter for policy?
That's very good question. This, I mean, so far we don't have the data to answer these questions. We are, you know, we have, but we are not able to answer this question. My educated guess on this is that no, because actually, if you think that green jobs are for, I mean, for low skilled worker, I mean, for high skilled worker, I think that job security will be more or less the same. But for low skilled worker, green jobs are concentrated in construction and in waste management and reparation, whereas brown jobs are more concentrated in sector, I mean, beside oil and gas, but also in the manufacturing sector. So actually, I think that the jobs that are more likely to be green are usually less kind of protected and less secure than the jobs that are more likely to be brown. And so actually, again, here, perhaps we need some policy that also enhance the incentive for worker in construction, for instance, to create unions, or you know, to be well represented in wage negotiation for you know, renewing the wages. Okay.
Thanks very much, Francesco. We'll have to leave it here for the moment. Let me now move to Anne Wolverton to present her thoughts, and I think she'd be covering the broader scope of environmental justice, not just the green transition.
Good morning. Yeah, I won't be talking about the just transition this morning. The OECD posed several questions for this session. I'm going to walk through each of them. There were 5, and offer some food for thought that hopefully will inform subsequent discussion, with a particular emphasis on areas where continued cross-country work facilitated by the OECD would be very valuable, at least from the US perspective. I do have slides, actually. I don't know. Do I have to a clicker? Okay. There we go. Okay. I'll go, did it go through? Yes, okay. I think I'm in the right spot. It's like, never know. Do I put my glasses on so I can see my slides, or do I take them off so I can see what I've got in front of me? There are 3 broad points that I wanted to make with regard to the first question. The first question being, what can be done better to tackle persisting and emerging environmental justice issues? First is to raise awareness of environmental justice concerns and create familiarity with their relevance in a wide array of contexts, which the OECD is already beginning to do. So wanted to give a huge thanks for convening this workshop and also for the report. And we can build on the success of that report and workshop to foster further cross-country learning. And in particular, there are a number of questions that I think could be posed as follow-ups to this discussion. How have countries grappled with and addressed similar environmental justice concerns within their own national context? We heard a little bit about that already. Which approaches have been successful in identifying, analyzing, or addressing environmental justice concerns, and why? And how have these insights been incorporated into regulatory and non-regulatory decision-making? And we heard today examples where Chile and South Africa are striving to incorporate these. And then lastly, identifying ways to meaningfully engage and build trust with vulnerable communities. The OECD report finds there's widespread attention on reducing barriers to participation in environmental decision-making for the general population. We would focus this then on a question of what policies and strategies are emerging to target engagement with vulnerable communities specifically. The second question that was posed to the panel is, as the scale and urgency of environmental policy grows, how can countries promote equitable processes and outcomes? So I'll highlight three possibilities here. One is more routine conduct of prospective analysis of the possible impacts of national policies and programs on vulnerable communities. The OECD report finds that impacts are often considered by countries when developing policy, but at highly aggregate scales, for example, at the sectoral level. It's also important to ask, with an EJ lens, to what extent are there pre-existing differences in exposure or sensitivities across affected groups? And how is the policy or program likely to affect those groups, including the potential for spatial heterogeneity and effects? In addition, meaningful involvement of vulnerable communities early and often to inform policy design and analysis is very important. We heard a lot about that yesterday and more today. Being able to evaluate what approaches have been effective in improving meaningful involvement in hard to reach communities and expanding opportunities for those communities to be co-leaders in developing more equitable outcomes is really important here. In addition, there was a question of whether we could leverage more data. A key question that we are in the process of trying to figure out ourselves in the US context is how to leverage citizen science to inform national decision-making. And then finally, we want to know whether all this activity is actually effective. So we should plan ahead for the conduct of retrospective analyses of policies and programs we're putting in place now, so we can more fully understand how these efforts have affected the outcomes of interest for the specific communities that we're trying to help. The third question that was posed for this panel is specific to labor markets and households. We already heard a lot in the previous talk about thinking about distributional effects for workers. What are the key equity considerations for labor markets and households both? So as with other countries, the United States seeks to advance environmental justice by reducing disparities in health and environmental risks. We don't typically describe environmental justice in terms of costs and benefits, but household burden and access to program benefits are increasingly relevant concepts. And so just to give you a couple of examples, that might, in the worker context, revolve around whether workers have proper access to personal protective equipment. It might also pertain to thinking through more carefully how costs are passed on in either higher electricity prices or drinking water rates, for example. These are challenging questions. You want to worry about the ultimate incidence of costs. And as we heard yesterday, spatial sorting can be an important piece of this. I'd also encourage us to think more holistically about households and workers, and in fact, try to link household and worker exposure profiles to get at the cumulative implications of multiple exposures across places where people spend their time. This is sometimes referred to as moving beyond nighttime exposures, to think about where people work, where they go to school, where they play. And we would also want to think holistically about exposure across different pathways, whether that's through product use in the indoor or built environment, take-home exposures, etc. I have a few examples in here, but I'm going to touch on them very, very lightly in the interest of time. In the US, we've been talking, have an effort underway to think about disparities in ubiquitous chemical exposure. This is sort of widely occurring, not necessarily through point sources. There's a big effort under the White House Cancer Cabinet that focuses on this. There is evidence of disparities by age and gender in both the US and European data. These are things like PFAS in drinking water and furniture, phthalates and parabens in personal care products, off-gassing in indoor environments. And what the research has found is those who are highly exposed to one type of chemical also tend to be highly exposed to other chemicals. This is a really challenging area because exposure happens through a whole myriad of behaviors: product use, occupation, housing choices. And while we have some idea of what chemicals are in different products, there's a lack of information on who's using them and how. And we would be concerned here, for example, about whether particular types of cleaning products, cosmetics, personal care products are more hazardous, and then is there more exposure amongst certain types of populations due to product use, due to occupational choice, due to lack of personal protective equipment. The next question that was posed, which is getting maybe a little bit closer to the idea of where the OECD might go next, was what are frontiers for economic and policy research to support this agenda? I could have put a laundry list on here, but I just picked 4. First, I think it's important to think about understanding barriers that inhibit access or inhibit adaptation and avoidance behaviors. We tend to sometimes focus a lot on financial barriers, but there is also a whole myriad of non-financial barriers that can be really important and determine the success or failure of particular programs. We also talked about provision of information to enable decision-making. What information is being provided and how it's provided is also really important. Understanding cumulative impacts is a big focus in the US right now, but there's a whole myriad of research gaps in this area as well. It's difficult because there are a myriad of historical and institutional factors, many of which are not specific to the environment, that can play an important role in current inequities, zoning, housing, transportation spheres. That means it's particularly challenging to address because it requires levers both within and outside the environmental space. However, we can think about the role of non-environmental stressors in increasing susceptibility as an important analytic and policy consideration. Yesterday, we heard about how there are certain groups that are more susceptible to particulate matter. So in the US, we also see this. Not only are certain groups more highly exposed to particulate matter, but for a given exposure, there are particular groups that have a higher response. And so the health risks are higher. So we want to think about what approaches are available to begin to explicitly account for the role of social stressors, and also think about this in the context of cumulative impacts. I heard a number of countries already mention navigating the tension between local concerns and national goals. This is also true in the US context. So just to give you a recent example, we recently promulgated a electricity sector rule to head in the direction of producing electricity using cleaner types of energy, but there were lots of local concerns around particular types of technologies, carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen. And we, I think, are still learning how to navigate between national goals and local concerns. Public participation and community engagement is the beginning of that, but then how they ultimately are reflected in the way we design policy is an important thing that I think we could learn a lot from other countries. And from an analytic lens, I think also figuring out how to leverage more mixed methods where we have qualitative and quantitative information to better reflect the lived experience of communities in national scale analysis is an important gap. And then finally, leveraging novel data sources and methods. So yesterday we heard that what types of environmental hazards and pollution that are studied are limited by data availability. We're in an era where there's a lot of new, really cool technologies, cell phone data, handheld monitors, satellite imaging information that would allow us to collect data on under and unmonitored areas, and also allow us to build non-residential exposure profiles to move beyond and more directly try to measure exposure. Again, I'm going to go through these example slides really, really quickly, but we've been doing some work recently on replacing lead service lines, which are split ownership in the United States between the local municipality and the homeowner. In addition to cost barriers, the homeowner is often responsible for thousands of dollars for replacement. There's a whole host of other non-financial barriers. I'm not going to detail them now in the interest of time, but I did want to mention some findings from a recent case study we finished in Trenton, New Jersey, where we compared two different programs that basically fully subsidized the cost to households of replacing the lead service line. But one of them basically just provided information that the program existed. And the other one took a very different tactic, which was to try to build trust through a local community group and a lot of local outreach, and also made the application process very, very simple. Not surprisingly, what we found is that the program that thought really hard about building trust and reducing those inconvenience costs saw uptake of the program. The other program, which also would make it essentially free to replace their service line, we saw almost no change as a result of the provision of information. Okay, I think this is my last slide. So the last question that the OECD posed is, what can be done better to tackle persisting and emerging environmental justice issues? So again, there's a lot of possibilities here, but I wanted to highlight just a few. So one idea would be to assemble a repository of links to tools, studies, and data sets useful across multiple country contexts. In addition to this, I think there's a role for case studies of what has worked and what hasn't that could be showcased on such a repository. Investing in harmonizing and lowering barriers to access for relevant environmental and perhaps other types of data that could be useful across countries would also be really useful. An example of that would be remote sensing data at appropriate spatial and temporal scales. And then finally, evaluating approaches that have or have not worked to improve access to environmental programs and benefits. I think public participation and meaningful engagement is an important piece of this as well. And I've already highlighted the importance of other non-financial barriers. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak.
Thanks very much, Anne, for this very thoughtful and comprehensive overview. I think there's a very big work program ahead for us. Thank you also for sticking so faithfully to all the questions that that we had put in the session. Are there any questions for Anne from the floor? Aldo, Italy, please.
Thank you. Very interesting and very useful reflections. I take home first the fact that priority should not be on emerging environmental policies and their potential social impacts, which are important. But I understand that you're stressing very much the need to analyze what is already in place, because many of our policies in each of our countries have problems of environmental justice, of fairness, of equity. I think it's an important balance. In some of our countries, we have a very strong attack on new environmental policies because hiding very often under social problems. There are social problems, we have to deal with them, but not necessarily they are the first priority. The existing situation seems to me a priority. The question is just if in your reflection, you're thinking that it might be interesting for your country to adhere, to enter in the conventions about environmental justice, environmental information, environmental participation, the Aarhus Convention, and the Escazú Convention, as they are instruments inside the United Nations world with the regional economic organizations, but it might be something useful. We found it extremely useful, for example, in Italy to advance on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aldo. Let me also invite Professor Wilson, please.
How much time we have?
Less than 30 seconds. Yeah.
Really good points here. So one of the things I just want to say real quickly, just the issue about just transition. In the US context, is for everybody here. There's been a lot of pushback from communities about hydrogen, about carbon capture, because they're seen as false solutions. And I would say scientifically, not enough data to approve of the solutions. Where the communities are overburdened, they're now going to dump these clean energy solutions in these same communities. And so without data to show that actually will not have adverse consequences, those communities that are already used as sacrifice zones become more, those issues become exacerbated. So that's a problem in the US. And then you extend the concept of cumulative impacts, and we're talking about exposure to chemical and non-chemical stressors. So it brings it intersectionality with physical stressors, right? You have like noise and heat. It brings in biological stressors. You think about COVID or E. coli, okay? It also brings in particulate matter and lead. So it's a lot of issues that folks are experiencing in the US. And so when we talk about issues of climate change as a major driver, cumulative impacts, I mean, this is for the EPA colleagues. How are we really going to push those good solutions in those communities? And how can that be replicated, across other countries when you have a lot of consternation and controversy with those solutions right now in our country?
Over to you, Anne.
I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Kareem. On the first question from Italy, I'm going to leave that to Kareem because I don't really actively follow, or my other colleagues actively follow what how that would fit within the international environmental agreements. With respect to the controversies of specific technologies in areas that are already overburdened by a host of stressors, I agree with you. The recent experience with the 111 rule, which is for the electricity sector, we received many thoughtful comments from local communities that are very concerned about specific types of technologies and what that means for both cold pollutants as well as additional new risks in their communities from pipelines and other contributors. At least from my perspective, looking at the analytic piece of it that fits in there, I think there's a tension between a national level policy and the levers that are available to us in that space, and then how to effectively partner with state and local regulators that might actually, be permitting these things, for example, to assure that we have guardrails in place such that the very real local concerns don't become a reality. I think we're still, actively navigating that space. I don't think we've necessarily fully found the answer. But I'll turn it over to Karim if he wants to add anything.
So I'm actually gonna punt on the Aarhus Convention question, but we can talk offline about some of the domestic implications of the convention. Regarding the question about communities and impact, what I would say broadly in that lane is that under this administration, we've made a very intensive commitment to using the mechanisms of getting community feedback on the impact of any of the initiatives that we've been proposing that we think will solve some of our climate problems. Using carbon capture storage as an example, there's been a very robust discussion between domestic civil society in the US and the government about how to make this work and what the risks are associated with it, particularly to communities that are already overburdened. So I would say continue to do your job and hold us accountable. And that's honestly the best thing that civil society can do as we develop the parameters and the technology and the standards around which we evaluate this technology in order to make sure we're not making the situation worse in different ways.
Thanks very much, Karim. And now I'll turn to the final speaker of the final session, Steve White.
Okay, thank you very much. I haven't done slides because I wanted to try and react to what was said. I think that was a foolish decision. There's been so much said, it's been almost overwhelming. It was actually a bit of a flashback. I chair the working party, which had the survey on the National Approaches paper, which I hope you've all looked at. I think it's absolutely excellent. I was delighted when we sent the survey out, and then Shardul sent it to me. I got it in Brussels and I thought, how do I answer this? Do I send it to my environmental justice colleagues? And I thought, I don't have environmental justice colleagues. And we went through a process of sort of trying to figure out what environmental justice was, what the terminology was, how it related to what we do. And I was very surprised because we sent out and it went through various ministries. As Franziska said, different institutions, different parts all have their own little approaches. As long as we allowed them to put in their little approach, normally by me writing something which they would then correct, and that way we, as bureaucrats always work, we found out we were doing an awful lot, but it wasn't very coherent and it wasn't consistent. And I think having a systematic assessment of what we were doing internally was really useful. And so I think one of the phrases I heard a couple of times today and yesterday was about frameworks and toolboxes, and I really think that's useful to have this systematic mapping of what is being done where and where it's working well. The where it's working well is an aspect which I don't think we know so much about, and I always think that the OECD can add to that. So I don't think we need a piece of legal acquis on what environmental justice is. I think if we were starting the legal acquis for the OECD now, we would have one. But just to have that framework and a systematic understanding is a really valuable first thing to do. So that would be good. We always need more analysis. I was in a joint meeting of tax and environment experts 2 weeks ago here in Paris. And they were talking about the cost of carbon for different income deciles for different countries. And I was really struck that for one of the countries, for the bottom decile, over a period of about 10 years, the cost of carbon for those households was about 4.5% on average of their income. That's serious figures. And that's why you get political kickback and the kind of anti-green messages. And 4.5% is an average, so that masks higher figures. Some households may be paying an extra 10% of their income in that particular country. So there's a recognition that the transition will have to be fair or it won't happen at all at the European level. But we need the analysis to identify where those hotspots are. Some countries, the carbon pricing was progressive, but in some it was highly regressive. So let's have the analysis, and I think that's an area where the OECD is always very good. One aspect which we've been looking at for a number of years is environment and labor markets. I'm not convinced that's one of the hotspots normally. I think quite often the churn in labor markets is so high that actually environmental policies are not a big factor. That doesn't mean there's no need for skills provision. And there are some hotspots. So for example, we've had lots of discussion about agriculture. Both in Paris and in Brussels, we see tractors on the streets fairly frequently. And what's the analysis which underpins that and lets us look at what's happening to some of those particular sectors and understand the link to mitigation of those impacts and how we deal with competitiveness concerns. I said that 4.5% of some households' income was carbon pricing. Quite often that's emissions trading schemes, so it's a transfer payment. So government takes the money. What does government do with that money? We have Just Transition Fund, we have social climate funds, but how do we properly target poorer households or more vulnerable households and make sure that we are helping them? So I think this discussion about how we recycle income to make sure that we can mitigate any negative impacts on communities. I think we've all talked about a little bit about some of those financing issues, but I think there's quite a lot more in-depth comparison to be done and analysis within individual countries. I liked Anne's reference to a laundry list. I think that's quite correct. This goes into so many different areas, and it's challenging to identify what should be done, not least because it's not a one-size-fits-all. We all have different cultural contexts, environmental contexts, social contexts, but there's a number of areas. So I think due diligence policies in terms of business is one area that's going to be increasingly looked at, whether we like it or not. That discussion is going on, at least in Europe, and I suspect there's more to be done on that. I think the question of indicators is extremely interesting. I think there's been things about composite indicators said in the last day or so, which struck me. I certainly didn't know about, and I think there's a lot of sharing of good practice to be done on that indicator part. Cumulative costs and cumulative impacts. Again, I think that's a really interesting area to delve into and see what's happening and to understand what's driving impacts for a particular household, how different policies combine. We have a fairly advanced impact assessment framework in the European Union, and it's an integrated assessment of economic, social, and environmental impacts. I don't think we cover environmental justice perhaps as well as we could within that, and I think it would be good to share experience about how within policy assessment, policy evaluation, different countries are looking at that and what we can learn from each other. Participatory governance is certainly another aspect where I think there's a lot of sharing to be done, even if it's maybe not an EU kind of competence. And one other sort of very broad area is I've become quite, I came in and I thought I will learn what environmental justice is. So I learned what environmental justice is. And then I actually thought, what is environmental justice? Is it justice? And I think this interaction between environmental justice and justice more generally is something we need to understand. So are there environmental justice policies which have negative justice impacts, or is environmental justice sometimes the best way to tackle the inequalities that we have in society as the starting point? And what's the interaction between these different approaches that we can learn from? So I'll stop there. It's a long laundry list. I'd like all the laundry done. I know that's not possible, so there's a few ideas there as to what might be particular areas for priority. But I really see this conference and the work underpinning it is already a very good start. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'd like to open the floor to, Please, John.
Hello, thank you. I'd like to make a quick point in that, as I said yesterday, most countries have the environmental data. The problem they've got is tying it to the socioeconomic data or groups that you're interested in, which leads you on to the question, what are the units of analysis you want to use? Should it be individuals and people? Should it be buildings, because so much of it ties to buildings? Or should it be more a broader neighborhood approach? And I think that's really important because countries got very different setups, administrative setups. So for America and Britain and the Netherlands, we've got really rich data and we can go down and do it at all levels. But I know, having done work with WHO over a decade, even a lot of Western European countries can't do that analysis. We've got a 1 kilometer air quality grid for all of Western Europe, but we can't do the analysis in most of the countries that we need at the resolution we need because they don't use those type of socioeconomic units at the moment. So I'd say to the different countries, think about what your units of analysis could be in the short term, and think about if you want to change them in the medium and long term, as we did, and which was tied to really it wasn't really just tied to environmental justice, it was tied to a recognition that it was better for government to have better data, particularly data that was time series, and to integrate and use standard units across all areas of government so you could tie these different data sets together.
Thanks very much. Sakubi, please.
Yeah, great conversation sitting by John, and just makes me want to go into tool nerd mode because I like mapping tools. So this really good points that he was making there. I would be remiss if I didn't do a slight plug. This great conversation. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Justice, by the way. So we can continue to have these conversations. Love to have some discussions. This is so much rich material. I was very excited. So environmental justice, everybody, please submit your papers. We should have OECD, like a theme issue and multiple issues. So happy to work on that. But I do think, I think one of the earlier speakers talked about the issue of just transition. And one of the things in the US that I didn't mention is, we have just interest for workers is very important. But in the US, we have a lot of workers, whether it be dirty fossil fuels or clean energy. There's a lack of diversity. We do not have people of color highly underrepresented in both on the dirty energy side and the clean energy side. So I just wanted to highlight that as a very important issue when we think about equity in just transition. So, and I think, the just transition frame in some spaces in the US has been very limited to workers. And I think this conversation is more than just for workers. And then my comment earlier about communities, what about those communities, again, who are dealing with those cumulative impacts? I think that's really, really important to think about. And then comment, I think maybe Dr. White mentioned the cumulative impacts. We have this growing body of cumulative impact assessment work in the US. So things to look to in the US, you have the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Maybe Kareem mentioned the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. You have multiple councils. You have the Exposure Science in the 21st Century Report. We talked about ubiquitous monitoring, right? So the need for ubiquitous monitoring to really get at. And also, how can we use, when we think about these data issues, machine learning? So I know we have issues with AI in different ways, and Asimov's 3 rules. We'll see what happens there for those who get the Asimov reference. But AI, machine learning, when it comes to mining all this data and be able to map this data and then be able to compare across our countries, I think that's another way forward.
Thanks very much. We're sort of moving from interventions to a conversation. So maybe if people have reactions to what has just been said, I think first I might just take, are there any reactions from first the panel, Steve, Anne, or Francesco? Okay,
we
Peter?
haven't been excused.
I have reaction. I mean, as you want.
Go ahead, Francesco.
Yeah. No, actually, I would like to react a bit on Stephen's comment that labor market impacts are not so important. I mean, we show that this is not true. I mean, actually, especially what I want to show in my presentation, perhaps it was not clear that these are really important in determining preferences of people. So actually, political preferences. And actually, we have always to remember, and I think this is a bit, sometimes missing, that, I mean, we have to make the political process working, because if the political process doesn't work, this is something that is really problematic. On the comment of the last on the last comment. Actually, and in general, the issue of cumulative impact, I completely agree. I mean, there are also ways of modeling them in economics. I mean, way of aggregating them using social cost of carbon, using statistical value of life, etc., etc. But there is one fundamental problem that we have to reflect on. People aggregate themselves, different stuff in a different ways. Okay, so actually, if the people of the lower end of the income distribution don't care a lot about environmental improvement, this is an issue, again, for political acceptability, because you give them a progressive improvement by reducing pollution in their area, which is not perceived as important. I mean, I completely agree that information is important, etc. But there is a really, I mean, an order of priority that depends on the income itself. I mean, in economics terms, preferences are non-homothetic. Unfortunately, the macroeconomics goes toward the, you know, the representative agent, not considering heterogeneity in non-homothetic preferences. But this is the key point of how people aggregate the different types of impact and perceive the different type of impact. Not only to find tools to measure the cumulative or different type of impact.
Kareem, please.
Yeah, I wanted to recognize Professor Valna. He makes a very important argument about how people react to prioritization when directly asked about it. But there's also an element that occurs in disadvantaged communities where they accept unacceptable, what we would consider an unacceptable environmental condition as something that they have to endure because it's their status quo. So it may not be something that they affirmatively identify as a priority, but once they're able to experience better air quality, better water quality, exposure to natural environments, there's an increased appreciation for it. So let's just be very careful about saying that it's not something that isn't a priority to disadvantaged communities. And a lot of times what we're dealing with is a disadvantaged community dealing with multiple social stressors and accepting conditions that would otherwise be described as intolerable because they can't actually see a way towards improving those conditions.
Peter?
Thanks. I'm taking advantage of you not excusing us from here. So just to touch on some points, and really drove the point home for me, John's comment, that a lot of our conversation is highly localized. And of course, it's quite correct. I mean, we're talking about communities, we're talking about individuals, peoples, municipalities, and what have you. But there's also been a lot of discussion around things like carbon trading, carbon capture and storage, and these kind of things, like carbon offsetting as well. Now, there's often pushback from communities, certainly around carbon capture and storage, because people don't trust anybody about this, what have you. So the often reaction is that, well, let's just do what Francesca sort of did as a sort of a throwaway statement, sort of, let's just move it offshore. And of course, I mean, one of the biggest pressures that is facing Africa at the moment is that a whole bunch of really carbon intensive companies, rather than reducing their emissions, are very, very keen on offsetting them. And they're offsetting it through what they're calling reforestation. They're not calling afforestation, reforestation. And Africa has suddenly come up on the screen as being the area to reforest. The assumption being is that the reason why we have savannas, millions of hectares of savannas with animals flying across the thing, is because we've chopped all the trees down. That's the kind of assumption, that we are going to now reforest those areas that Africans basically destroyed. This is an amazing instance of environmental racism. And we really have to be so careful around these kind of offsetting things where suddenly it's seen as a green investment, where in actual fact, it's hugely environmentally destructive. Thanks.
Let me invite the youth-wise speaker.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pablo Iribarren. I'm a member of the YouthWise, which is the OECD Youth Advisory Board. First, I wanted to reflect very quickly on the impact of environmental injustice on the youth. I think yesterday we discussed the impact of seed code and housing unaffordability, which actually has a disproportionate impact on youth. It is a key concern. House unaffordability is a key concern across countries that is dramatically getting worse and worse. We discussed today as well that young climate activists that are getting prosecuted for supposedly being part of criminal organizations. And I think as well, needless to say, as climate is getting worse and worse, the youth is going to be the one suffering the impacts the more and for the longer time. So then what's next? Because decisions are being taken now that are going to have a higher impact on the young generations. So from Youthwise, we defend that the youth cannot be mere spectators. The guiding theme of our Youthwise cohort has been, how can we go from youth consultation, which is great, but also to have more youth decision-making, to have the youth at the decision-making table. We believe that the youth should be represented at the decision-making table of ministries. My colleague Anahira yesterday showed a great example of youth advisory board at the environmental ministry of New Zealand. I think we see the benefit as well of having youth at the executive committees of private sector companies. Maybe some of the private sector companies present here would also could benefit from that. And also, why not as well having youth at committees of international organizations? Why not having, for instance, a set of OECD young employees part of the environmental justice committee that is going to be set up in the upcoming months? So from Youthwise, we invite everyone here, everyone present in the room, to think of ways to put youth at the decision-making table, to ensure that the intergenerational justice is part of the conversation. And if at some point of the session or afterwards, anyone wants to share these ideas from Youthwise, we'll be very interested to know them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are really happy to engage Youthwise on this conference with the presentation by Anahira yesterday and your intervention. Look forward to continuing to engage with you. Let me now invite Tuek.
Thank you very much, Shardul, and thanks again to the OECD for having organized this 2 days conference. It's been truly enlightening, and I think it shows really the OECD at its best. I just wanted to quickly reflect on one issue that is really key for us and somehow a little bit concerning as well, is this growing sense of risk of fragmentation of environmental justice demands. We talked a lot about workers versus victims of climate change, for instance, today. And I think this is really concerning for us, because we also talked about the absence of a definition of just transition. Well, there is an internationally agreed non-binding definition of just transition. And these definitions not only captures mitigation and the need to make sure that workers who will lose their jobs will not be left off, will not be left behind, and will find good jobs, but it's also about adaptation. And it's also recognizing that, exploitation of the nature, exploitation of resources and exploitation of people, poor labor conditions, etc., they come from the same root. Usually they have the same root, and they have the same drivers in countries. It's economic pressure, it's lack of enforcement mechanism. So would be really happy to hear perhaps more on your reflection on how can we avoid this fragmentation of environmental justice demands and requests in countries and globally, and whether potentially a concept like well-being at the workplace, well-being at work and in societies can be useful concepts to try to build a social progressist agenda around climate action. Thank you.
Before I invite the next intervention, would anybody either here in the panel or anybody else would like to respond to the specific question that Tuek has asked? Yours is, then why don't you please go ahead?
I wanted to lift up an example that EPA's, and this was an initiative of the Administrator Regan made this a priority. He actually created an environmental advisory council specifically for youth. And many of our federal advisory councils that I spoke about earlier have seats reserved for young advocates, but the Youth Advisory Council is unique in that the composition and the focus is about making sure that young people have an opportunity to be a part of that policy development and decision-making process. And it was just convened in March, so it's a little early for lessons learned. But if any of the other member countries are interested in the process by which we developed it, we're more than eager to share that information.
Please, at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicolas Coté. I'm a researcher at the University of British Columbia. And I just wanted to add something to what you were saying, I think, which is really interesting, is that we have this fragmentation that might be happening between like justice for workers left behind and justice for those most affected by climate change. And I think there's something in your presentation, Professor Vona, that you said at the beginning about the concept of recognition justice as well. And I know we talked most about distributive justice, but this issue, I think, of recognition justice ends up finding its way back into this problem of fragmentation because we end up with workers or communities that are feeling left behind versus people who are effectively being most impacted by climate change. And we're trying to think about who to support the most in this just transition. And I'm wondering if this issue of, well, if we don't support the workers enough, we will have a lot of backlash on our climate policies, our climate plans are not going to be accepted. I'm wondering how much of an impact this has on our priorities in terms of what a just transition actually looks like. I think this is kind of the first point. And the second is, well, like, what does recognition justice mean in that sense then? Like, do we need policies that tell people's stories better, that do this kind of recognition justice instead of just distributive justice?
Thanks very much. Francesco, would you like to step in on these?
I think the recognition justice is also, thanks a lot for the very interesting comments. I think recognition justice is also something that is related to the comment of Tueg, sorry. I think the general issue is that in our society that are hyper competitive, where we are really in a way struggling to have free time to feel the life in another way. I think there is space. Is this compatible, this style of life, with a style of life that is more respectful for the environment in general, both at the workplace, at home, and in general, do we need to a bit rethink our scale of priority? And this is also related to Karim. I completely agree with you, Karim, that we can change things. But we need to be aware that perhaps people at the lower end of the income distribution may care less about the environmental benefit than about material stuff. So if we are aware of this, we can provide better information. So the general idea is that if this type of capitalism is suitable to tackle all these problems. And regarding the question of the researcher at Columbia, I think, first of all, here, I think we need better data to understand if those communities that will be more affected by climate change are also those that will be more affected by mitigation policy in terms of job destruction. We need maps also along this dimension. We need the correlational maps along this dimension. But I think there is a problem because the job costs are short-term costs. Instead, the benefit from climate mitigation policies materialize in the long term. So actually, there is the usual problem of how people discount the future. And again, we know that there is a kind of gap because the discount factors are normally higher. The people, at the lower end of the distribution is more impatient. And so actually there is again the same issue of this. But obviously you have to try. I think a good policy have to try to reconcile both aspects of environmental justice. And I completely agree with you that recognition justice is one of the key issues. Let's say the status quo and I would say also the hysteresis of past transition, for instance, is super important. And I think all the discussion and narrative around the just transition is exactly because we failed past transitions, because otherwise there will be not the need to discuss so much about the just energy transition. So
thanks very much. I'm going to first take two questions or comments from the floor, and then slowly move to the experts, first to the panel, and then to the experts from previous sessions. So Mexico first, followed by the UK.
Thank you. So I just wanted to echo the comments made by the YouthWise delegate. I think that there's a very important component that should be considered here, the intergenerational aspect of environmental justice is definitely something that should be included in projections that are being made today, and they definitely should be a part of this conversation. I think that also I will share some concerns with my Latin American colleagues here, that we go beyond the Eurocentric approach of looking at these issues. We have seen in our countries that most of the burden, environmental burden is carried by communities, indigenous communities that are really suffering most of this and have not really a very strong voice, unfortunately, and their activists are equally treated in general as criminals, and often appear just more likely disappear in a very like questionable conditions. So I just wanted to mention those two aspects. Thank you.
Thank you. The UK and then Canada, and then I'll move to the panel.
Thank you. It's Joe Switter from the Environment Agency in England. Just a couple of comments really, and an offer for help. We've been leading two projects really around the lived experience, and that's all about really understanding those communities most impacted and the most vulnerable. And the reason we did that really is to see, obviously it identifies gaps and challenges, but also how we can align with policymakers. So part of those projects was really about how we optimize policy based on some of those lived experiences, but also amplifying voices. So, we engaged with the young, the old, different ethnic groups, travel, the transport sort of areas, and also employment areas. So we're happy to share, we've got two reports really, one around access to blue space, one around air quality and health inequality. So we'd like to share those with anyone, so please do get in touch if you'd like to understand really around how to take that lived experience into policy making. And the second area is that we, as an agency, have been trying to understand how equitable we are for the communities we serve, and how we can drive equity throughout our agency. And part of that is really working with others. So we have a report in draft that we are happy to share. And hopefully that report can start to answer some of the questions that the OECD is asking around environmental justice. We went through the survey process with our stakeholders. We also went through our case studies, a mapping of our documentation, and also what others are doing in the international arena as well. So just to say, we've got those reports to share, and we'd like to connect and work with others across this area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, UK. I'm conscious that we are almost at the end of time. So if I could invite the remaining speakers to be relatively concise. So Canada first.
Yeah, just a quick reflection. Wondering if, in the absence of the acknowledgement of environmental justice as a broad umbrella term with a subset of more specific concepts and approaches like climate justice, energy justice, environmental racism, there's a risk of dilution, both in analytical approaches. In some instances, there's multiple approaches that are useful to understand the intersections of a particular issue, and in potential measures. And just further that, issues related to inequity are localized and contextual, and perceptions of justice and what constitutes a just response are also very subjective. And so addressing issues at the intersection of environment and social concerns really require precision and specificity. And so I think that's one big takeaway from the last 2 days is environmental justice is certainly quite broad, but there are more specific pieces in understanding those. And I think pulling those apart and being very specific is important. So you can take an intersectional approach to environmental inequities at large.
Thank you so much. Anne?
Actually, I'll just build directly on Canada's comments because I think, and also wanted to kind of expand on a comment that Dr. Wilson made earlier, which is that there is a distinction between concepts like just transition and environmental justice, right? Workers or households who are affected by transition from working in a dirty energy industry to a clean industry might not be the groups that we're targeting when we're talking about environmental justice. They might be two distinct groups. They might have different issues. I think Dr. Wilson's point about thinking about how communities might be affected by just transition is right on point, because those might not be the workers. They might not be employed in those industries, but they might be affected in a myriad of ways by the types of technologies and energy systems we're putting into their neighborhoods, and the resulting risks that are posed to them, as opposed to directly to wage markets. So I just wanted to highlight that in terms of keeping these understanding these concepts are all very distinct, and that they might apply in different ways, and have areas of intersection, but clear areas of difference as well. Thank you.
David?
I'll make this brief, and forgive me in advance for this, but it is a panel on frontiers of action, and I'm a professor of politics, so it'll be a pretty obvious question. There's just been surprisingly little discussion about the issue of power and the power of industry. And I mean, this has been a central issue for environmental justice advocates from the beginning. It's in the principles. Where is the discussion of, not sort of end of pipe solutions and not sort of helping communities after they've been poisoned, but getting industry to stop polluting communities and to clean up after themselves, right? So what can the OECD do in future to sort of address this question of the power of industry, the collusion between industry and government, in making environmental policy and regulations and enforcing them?
Thank you. And Sakubi for the last intervention.
Oh yeah, be quick, huh? So I have a term, because I don't think environmental justice is a strong enough term. We have a term called environmental slavery, just to throw that out there for folks. You can look it up on Medium. I think when it comes to this work, policy is great, but the little p in policy, and I want to say yesterday, only French I know is a mouche bouche, so a little bite. So how do you get the little bits of information to people, right? Connect the issues to food, faith, family, health, and jobs. How are making sure your policies is really helping folks, and the things that are most important, that's everyday, that's proximal, that's pocketbook. That's what EJ is. EJ is proximal, right? So you have the national policies like in the EPA, US with the Executive Order 1408, right? Then you come down to the state level. I do a lot of work with state agencies, doing community engagement research. We work in collaboration with state agencies to make sure things are going well as it relates to advancing environmental justice. That is a framework for moving forward. We have climate action hubs in the US. So how are you actually working with communities who are impacted by these issues, seeing how the policies work, investing dollars, right, and getting those co-benefits? That's a model that can be replicated. Climate action hubs, foundations are doing a lot of funding of climate action hubs in the US. National Academy of Sciences is doing it as well. So I just want to mention that. And then the last point about the workers piece, we're working right now on a proposal to bring workers in, because environmental justice at its heart is also an economic justice movement, and making sure workers, including returning citizens, are able to get jobs and get opportunity. So that's another framework that you can use to bring in workers into this space. I just wanted to share those quick comments.
Thank you very much. And for the very last intervention, Brazil.
Hi, my name is Bernardo Guidali, and I work for the Federal Police in Brazil in the division of the Amazon Forest and Environmental Crimes, and like to make a question for the panelists. First, I would like to connect the idea of environmental injustice and environmental disasters. Brazil is facing now a big disaster because of the rain and the climate change in the state of the Rio Grande do Sul. Almost 1 million people lost their houses and 500,000 lost their cars. Mussum City was underwater for the third time in the last 12 months. These events will increase social problems in the next months and years, and as a consequence, raise environmental injustice. So my question is, what to do? What do you recommend to countries as Brazil that these problems are happening now, and also in order to avoid these problems to happen in the future? Thank you.
Anybody from the panel who would like to weigh in?
No.
Okay. It's a very hard question, and I hate to leave such a question hanging at this time, but I'd like to. Oh, Kareem will give it a shot. Okay.
You're asking a question that implicates a bunch of causes and a bunch of potential actions. And that's the great part about the OECD, is that you actually have a community of practice here where you can look at the measures that individual countries have taken in order to deal with some of these issues. So you've got deforestation, you've got flooding, you've got the overall boogie man behind us all, which is the consequences of climate change causing more severe weather disruptions. So you've got resiliency issues that you have to address. I don't think this, just answering your question would be a multi-day experience. But the good news is that you can lean on OECD as a resource. You can lean on your partner jurisdictions to look at some of the practices that we've implemented, and I would say continue to engage.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the stimulating discussion, not just in this session, but the entire conference. We weren't sure how many of you would come and whether you would survive such an intense agenda. So it's quite exciting to see such a vibrant discussion at the end. Just to close this session, I mean, when we pose all these questions on environmental justice at the start of the conference, I mean, looking back, there's this famous quote which people use a lot in graduate schools in the US, we may not have succeeded in answering all of the questions, but we think it seems as we are as confused as ever, but we think we are confused at a higher level and about more important things. So I'd like to end the discussion with that, but now I'm going to pass to Joe to give the formal closing remarks.
I've just thrown myself off the table. Wow, this has been an excellent meeting. I've been, of course, in many OECD sessions, but the conversation, the exchanges of ideas in this one, I think takes things to a bit of a new level and really has introduced some new thinking into the processes we follow. So I do want to draw this first ever at the OECD Conference on Environmental Justice to a close, starting by thanking all of our 22 speakers who joined us from around the world to share their insights and expertise. I also want to thank our moderators who helped to make each of these sessions a success. And of course, especially I want to say thank you to all of you who joined us here in Paris and online for the conference. As Shardul said, we weren't sure how many were going to turn up, but we've been delighted by the level of interest and for your engagement and insights in the many discussions. We have covered an incredible spectrum of environmental justice issues, not all of them, it would seem, from some of the comments in the final session, but we've covered economics, data needs, environmental law, political science, and chemical accidents, just to name a few. And it's become very clear there's a real mosaic of viewpoints and perspectives. Confusing perhaps indeed, but they're all extremely relevant for developing more inclusive environmental policies and outcomes. And I think this meeting really demonstrates the value of a holistic, multidisciplinary and international approach to environmental justice. As I said at the beginning, it's a relatively new international topic, but we've really been able to identify some shared thinking and experiences amongst this great diversity. Now, in particular, I'm reminded of some of the insights, a couple of things from our discussions. We started with an incredibly rapid and informative walkthrough of EJ definitions and a summary of where research is today, to clearly illustrating from that we need to work harder to ensure we learn from the injustices of the past, actually some of them of the present as well, to avoid our policies of today repeating mistakes wherever possible, and to ensure that our transition to a more sustainable future is inclusive, leaving nobody behind. Now, perhaps this was most clearly illustrated by Anahira, who reminded us that the language we use even at this conference, needs to change to ensure a broader engagement and inclusion with everyone at the table. With that, I hope this conference marks the beginning of regular, ongoing OECD contributions to advancing environmental justice through building the data and evidence that's going to support local, national, and international policy development. Really appreciate your thoughts and the sessions this morning. Shardul has taken copious notes, so we know we've got a lot we can consider focusing on. I would like to finish by thanking the interpreters for making this conference accessible in English, in French, and in Spanish. So, and many thanks to the sizable coordinating and support team for facilitating what's been a really important event for us. Last but not least, I want to thank the team in the OECD's Environment and Economy Integration Division, I can barely say that, EEI, under Shardul's leadership for bringing in such an excellent lineup of speakers, with very special thanks to the three assistants, Vilma Gertane, Ivan Babi, and Ilyas Mus. And finally, the Environment Directorate Communications team for contributing to what we hope has been a truly groundbreaking event. So thank you everyone for being here. And I've got to finish on a small housekeeping note, a reminder to take all your belongings with you as you leave the room. We're going to move straight into another session very shortly on the Environment Policy Committee. So thank you all very much again. We've really loved having you here.